Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for coming today because Josephine Baker is one fascinating woman and her spycraft isn't well known enough. We need to spread the word. One little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Because of the nature of clandestine work like spycraft, a lot of this stuff was never written down. Some of these missions that she was on were unauthorized. Some of the paperwork was destroyed during the war, World War II. Most of this information comes from this book here called Agent Josephine. It's by Damian Lewis, the author, not the famous actor that you may be familiar with, who also does spy work, so I think that's interesting. When I was not able to corroborate the information, or if I found two differing versions, I made note of that and I'll mention it during the program. All right, let's get right into it. As most of you know, the great and fascinating Josephine Baker was from St. Louis. She was born here. She was here until she was about 13. What you may not know is that she hated it here, unfortunately. She grew up in abject poverty. She was extremely poor. She lived mostly with her mother and her sister in a shack that had no heating and certainly no AC, because that was way too new back then. But she was actually one of several children that would run after the coal truck that would, drop coal by for people who could afford to heat their houses, just hoping that some of the coal would drop off so that she could pick it up. The other thing about Josephine Baker was she did experience a lot of horrible racial prejudice while she was here. And unfortunately, when she was very young, probably around 11, she saw these people literally running for their lives, people of color, from East St. Louis into St. Louis. She saw the terror on their faces and she didn't know what they were running from, but she started running too because it was just terrifying and very traumatic. She found out later that it was one of the many race riots that happened in East St. Louis, and 29 people were slaughtered very brutally in East St. Louis at that time. Now, many people who become superstars later on will either be in denial of their past or kind of like make up their own little mythology to put all that behind them. Josephine Baker, we will find out, did not do that. As a matter of fact, all of that made her into the person she became, and it informed her decision to become a spy during World War II. So in the 1930s, Josephine Baker was the Beyonce of the age. She was a global superstar. Everybody knew who she was. She was on the radio. She started out as a dancer. She made a big splash, and she was on Broadway. She ended up moving to a revue that toured Europe, and when she got to France, she said, "I am home." She immediately expatriated to France, and she performed there constantly. She usually did 2 shows per evening. This woman was indefatigable. So a lot of times she would perform at the Casino de Paris, where she was doing sold-out shows, and then she would perform here. This is a photo from her own club that she owned in Paris called the Chez Josephine, where she would dance a late show, way past midnight with a dancing pig. I don't have a lot of information about that, but many of you know she was a huge animal fan, and she has quite a menagerie. So in addition to dancing, she made a big splash in this outfit when she danced in a banana skirt. She also, she was bilingual, so she spoke fluent French after she lived in France for a while. She obviously spoke English. She would record in both languages, and her albums were huge sellers. And once again, like Beyonce followed in her footsteps, she did world tours. So she wasn't just big in Europe, and she, of course, performed in the United States, but she performed in Australia, she performed in North Africa, she performed in South America. So she was, like I said, a global superstar and just so popular. And another thing that she did was she performed in movies. She was huge in the pictures back then. Remember, this was way before television was invented. So she was in a lot of musicals. She was in a lot of screwball comedies. She had quite the comic timing, and she was very funny, though, as Kemi mentioned, she was also an extremely beautiful woman. And so she was in films like this one. This is Zuzu. She was also in a film that was called Princess Tam Tam. And I want you to hold that in your mind. We're going to work on your spy skills today, okay? Remember Princess Tam Tam. So this was a knockoff of My Fair Lady, where she starts off as an African shepherdess, and then she is made over into an African princess, and she, with her grace and her style. She convinces everyone that she is true royalty. And that was a blockbuster of the time. Lots of people saw Princess Tamtam, and they saw it globally. Now, despite the fact that she was so famous, like I said, she didn't forget where she came from. She remembered how hard poverty was. And so even though now at this point she's the richest woman in the world, she's also the most photographed woman in the world, she was still helping out the poor of Paris, right? Her adopted home. She would go out in her Rolls Royce and she would go into the ghettos of Paris and she would bring food and medicine and clothing to help them out. She also would bring toys for the children because she knew she didn't have toys when she was a kid. And also, there's nothing that Josephine Baker wanted more than a child of her own. Many of you know that later on she adopted several children. So that was like her big dream, even bigger than her superstardom. So she took care of them. And when Hitler came to power in Germany, once again, that she knew, she understood that prejudice that he was pushing, that hatred. And as the first refugees started leaving Germany and Austria, which was the first area he had invaded, people were leaving with just the bare essentials. They were lucky to be out of there with just one piece of luggage. Some of them had only the clothes on their back. And so Josephine Baker sprung into action. She didn't wait for somebody to say, oh man, can you help us out here? No, she was an aviatrix. Some of you may not have known that. So she flew her own plane and she owned her own plane. And so she immediately volunteered to work with the Red Cross to help out the refugees that were pouring into places like Belgium. And so she would fly her own plane and she would bring food and clothing and supplies to those refugees. She wasn't allowed to bring medicine. But understand this, she was flying her own plane, so it didn't have a big Red Cross on it. And if by accident she got a little bit too close to Germany, they could have shot her down and then just said, oh, we didn't realize she was doing humanitarian aid. So already this early, before war was even declared, Josephine Baker knew how dangerous the Nazis were. And she was already risking her life to help out. So that brought her to the attention of this man. This is Paul Palaiol. He was the head of the Deuxième Bureau. Now, the Deuxième Bureau was like the equivalent of our CIA today, right? It did intelligence work, spy work. Now, this is one of the places where the narrative diverges. So according to Paul Palaiol, who was the head of the Deuxième Bureau, he was the one who reached out to Josephine Baker to see if she would spy for him. Josephine Baker and some other sources say that Josephine Baker went to him and offered her services because she hated Hitler and despised the Nazis so much. I tend to agree on the fact that Josephine Baker went to him for a couple of reasons. One is because Josephine Baker was world famous, so it wasn't like, she was going to be able to be undercover. The other thing is, prior to World War II, very few countries, very few ever allowed women to do undercover work. That changed in World War II, but this is early, early days. As you know, probably the most famous spy prior to World War II was Mata Hari, and that didn't work out well for the French. So the other thing is what he did, a little bit ahead of time here, is when Josephine Baker went to him, whether he called her or she went up to him, he didn't accept right away that she would make a good spy. Once again, remember, she was famous for doing screwball comedies. She'd pull faces. She danced in a skirt made out of bananas. Not particularly the kind of person to do, say, covert operations with, clandestine secrets of the nation. So Palaiol sent her to this man, Jack Apte. We're going to hear a lot about Jack. He ended up being Josephine's handler. Now, if you're kind of want to have an idea of who Jack Apte was, you would not go wrong with thinking of the Daniel Craig version of James Bond. He was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, quite the womanizer, and he also went rogue a lot. He had some problems with authority, which is why Palaiol sent Josephine to him, saying, find out if she has the moxie to be a spy. Find out if she can be trusted to go on these missions and not lose her nerve, because I don't know if this lady who dances in a banana skirt can be trusted. So Jack Apte and Josephine Baker had a 2-hour discussion where he was just like, why do you want to spy? I know you don't like Hitler, but tell me more about why we should trust you with this kind of national security. And Josephine Baker, like I said, I had a long discussion with him, but what it really came down to was when she said when she reached France, she finally found the freedom that she had always wanted. She gave her heart to that country, and she was willing to give her life for it. Her earnestness convinced Jack Apte that she was indeed ready to be a spy. And they talked about why she hated Hitler and the Nazis so much, and a lot of it had to do with this man, another famous and very talented black man from the United States, and that is Jesse Owens, seen here between a couple of guys doing the Nazi salutes. We're gonna get off that picture. Okay, so this is Jesse Owens, a great man. In the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Hitler's big plan was to show the world how his Aryan race that he was touting all the time was superior, how much greater they were than everyone else. And Jesse Owens foiled that by winning 5 gold medals and showing just how wonderfully talented and athletic he was. Now that made Hitler crazy because he couldn't put up with it. I hope you don't think that fake news is a modern thing. It was not. Hitler was also just a genius at it. He knew how to tell lies enough times so that people believed it. And so he told people that the reason Jesse Owens won so many medals in the Olympics was that he was Untermenschen. That means less than or subhuman. And that made Josephine Baker crazy because she knew what a lie it was. So, everybody listened to Hitler when he talked, right? He was in the newspapers, he was on newsreels that played before the films of the day, he was on the radio, but Josephine Baker was also a superstar. And she knew how dangerous Hitler was. So she went on the radio and she talked in the newspapers and she goes, you know what, Jesse Owens is a great man and you shouldn't listen to Hitler because he doesn't know what he's talking about. She made no secret of the fact that she disliked Hitler and she wanted to do anything she possibly could to stop him. So at this time, like I said, she signed up with the Deuxième Bureau to do some spy work. She continued to work with the refugees while she was waiting for her first mission. Refugees by this time were pouring into France, running from countries that Hitler had invaded. He invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia. Britain finally declared war. Remember, at this point, the United States was still neutral. They were staying out of it, very isolationist. So Josephine Baker really had her work cut out for her, and she was going to soup kitchens and handing out, ladling out soup and handing out sandwiches. She wasn't just glad handing people. She was actually doing the work. And then she was still doing 2 performances a night. So, like I said, pretty spectacular right from the very get-go. So then she says, what's my first mission? And, Paul Palale and Jack Apte said, you need to go investigate this man. If we can ever get back there. You already know who he is, easily recognizable. Benito Mussolini. So he's just like, I want you to go to Italy, and I want you to find out if Mussolini is going to throw in with Hitler or if he's going to remain neutral. So Mussolini was also a fascist like Hitler was, but they really didn't get along. He thought Hitler talked too much, and he probably did. But Franco was also a fascist. He was the head of Spain, but he decided to remain neutral because Spain had just finished a horrible civil war. His coffers were empty, so he couldn't send Hitler any money, and basically most of the men of fighting age had killed each other in the Spanish Civil War, so he didn't have any troops to send either. So Franco goes, I'm going to remain neutral. Now don't be fooled, Spain was very much in sympathy with the Nazis, so a lot of things, they did a lot of things to help out the Nazis, but they did not send troops. So in the meantime, Britain is really worried here. They're trying to work out their war strategy, and they want to find out if Mussolini is going to remain neutral like Franco, or if he's going to throw in with Hitler. Josephine Baker by this time was banned from performing in Germany, probably because Hitler knew that she was talking about him, and he hated that, right? But also he said that she was indecent during her performances, which, to be honest, he might have had a little bit to back him up there. But still, so she couldn't perform in Germany, even though she had performed there for years and always did sold-out shows. But she could perform in Italy, and she did, right? So that was what she was supposed to do. She had all these sold-out shows set up. She goes, what's my cover going to be? And they're like, there's no cover. You're going to be Josephine Baker. We can't stick a mustache on you and put a funny hat on your head and not expect people to run out and go, can I have your autograph? So Josephine Baker was going to perform these shows. But like Beyonce and Taylor Swift and all these other big stars, they had after parties and they had receptions for her. And there she would meet all the people that in the aristocracy that Benito Mussolini hadn't killed yet, and also Mussolini's inner circle. And so her job, along with Jack Apte, who went along undercover as her tour manager, was to find out from them if Mussolini was going to join Hitler or if he was going to remain neutral. Now, because of Josephine Baker's efforts, the information that Benito Mussolini was going to join with Hitler as part of the Axis was on Winston Churchill's desk weeks, if not a full month, before it was officially announced. That wasn't a direct line from Josephine Baker to Winston Churchill. It was a very circuitous path, but still, her first mission was incredibly successful, and she found that information out, doing a great job, and Jack and Paul Palaiol were very impressed. Now, unfortunately, before her second mission could start, tragedy happened. Germany invaded France, and France fell quicker than Afghanistan did this last time. They thought they could hold them off in the Maginot Line. They didn't. It fell within 3 days. And in the end, Colonel from the First World War, Pétain, basically made an agreement, made a deal with the devil, with Hitler, and he says, okay, don't kill any people anymore, and this was the deal that was made. They basically cut France in half. The northern half, including Paris, went under Nazi control, went to Hitler. You'll notice they also took all of the Atlantic coastline in France because they knew that Britain was after them. They wanted to go ahead and fortify the borders. That small blue part towards the bottom, towards the southern half, was known as the Free Zone. Don't be fooled. Everybody knew that it was just a matter of time before Hitler reneged. He always lied, just like he had on the non-aggression pact with Russia. It was also known as Vichy. That was supposedly the new capital. Now, everybody realized that, the Nazis were already watching southern France and that it was probably just a matter of time before they invaded. But everybody from the northern part of France that were not German collaborators headed in droves down to Vichy, and that included Josephine herself. And she had a place to go, a nice little chateau. Ooh. This was it. Not a bad place to spend the rest of the war, correct? So this was her Chateau de Milan. It is in the Dordogne Valley along the Dordogne River. It's kind of sizable, so it's 3 stories high. It has 16 bedrooms, and she goes down there. Now, she didn't leave alone. In her big Rolls Royce, she had some of her menagerie with her, right? She had Chiquita the cheetah. She had 2 different kinds of monkeys, a pair of white mice, and this nice Belgian couple. And she's driving down to the Chateau Milan. And once she's there, she's joined with some other people, and that included 2 of the former agents from the Deuxième Bureau. Now, when Pétain made the agreement and capitulated to Hitler, of course, the Deuxième Bureau, like our CIA, would have been completely dissolved. So they no longer had their own intelligence agency. But these people were patriots. They believed in the freedom of France and what it stood for. So they still wanted to fight the good fight, and so they were going to be joining the French resistance. So Palaiol sent a couple of his former agents down there, and then Jack joined Josephine too. Perhaps because of the spycraft, but by this time they were also lovers. I'm thinking that was kind of inevitable. But anyway, so he was down there too. So it's a good thing that there were 16 bedrooms because it was pretty crowded down there. So Josephine Baker hadn't really moved in for that long when suddenly there was a knock at the door. And who was it? It was the French resistance, because they knew Josephine Baker hated Hitler and wanted to fight the Nazis. So they knew that she would support them. So they go in there and are like, oh, Madame Josephine, may we perhaps hide some weapons here? And by the way, that big tower at the top, can we use that for a radio tower to see if we can get a hold of the British? And she's like, come on in. She was very supportive of the French resistance, and she was happy to help out. Like I said, she had all these former spies in her house as well. So she was happy to help out. Unfortunately, like I said, everybody knew that Josephine Baker was anti-Hitler. So a couple weeks later, there was another knock on the door. And it wasn't good news. It was the Gestapo. So fortunately, Jack Apte was out on the Dordogne River fishing for their dinner, but the rest of the inhabitants of the house were stuck there because the Gestapo surrounded the entire state And this is another place where the stories diverge. But either way, Josephine Baker did all the right things. So the Gestapo come in. One version has that she sat in her favorite room in the chateau, which I am very glad to say was the library, and she did a verbal thrust and parry with the commandant of the Gestapo, who was trying to get her to slip up, because he's thinking, this is just some goofball who's in screwball comedies and sings a lot. I can get her to slip up. I can get her to tell me who the French resistance fighters are. I can get her to, let me know who else is anti-Nazi so that I can arrest her. But he didn't make any headway with that. The other version has her going room to room along with all the Gestapo agents, as they were doing a hard target search to find anything that would incriminate Josephine Baker or any evidence that she was working with the French resistance. Now, when I say a hard target search, what I mean is they weren't looking under the bed and opening up the armoires to see if anybody was inside. No, they were using bayonets to slice open the mattresses to see if anybody was secreted in there. They were actually dropping furniture to the floor to see if there were any hidden cupboards or passageways. And in a chateau this size, that was very possible. So they went through destroying every room. And Josephine Baker, supposedly, like I said, one version, just followed along like she didn't have a care in the world, nothing to worry about here. It's not like I did this thing where I did this mission against Benito Mussolini. It wasn't like I've been hiding French resistance guys. She's just walking around, chatting away. And like with the Gestapo commandant, that she didn't give away any information. So all that acting apparently paid off, right? She knew what she was doing, a very cool customer. At the end, all these strapping young Aryans, they're just so worn out, so many rooms to look through. They went through all three stories, and like I said, pretty much left a wake of destruction everywhere they went. But at the end, they found nothing. Right? And so the commandant is all angry, and he's just like, you know what? I don't trust you. We're going to keep an eye on you. This isn't over. We'll be back. Then his Gestapo agents mostly left with photographs of Josephine Baker signed because they're all big fans because she was a superstar. Everybody loved her in Germany, right? So, they were just doing what they were supposed to be doing. But, Josephine Baker just acting like, this is no problem. This is just a day in the life. So they leave. And it's a good thing they left when they did. And it's a good thing they were all worn out going through those three stories. Because had they gone in the basement, they would have found 13 to 15 French resistance fighters. They would also found caches of weapons that included rifles and grenades. Now, Josephine Baker would have been arrested and interrogated if she had been found with that. Now, she was a very charming lady. She was a lot smarter than anybody gave her credit for. They were all assuming that because she danced in a banana skirt, she didn't know what she was talking about. But she was very sharp. And so there's a good possibility that she could have charmed her way out of it. She probably couldn't have saved those resistance fighters, but she could have probably saved herself and just said, I don't know how they got in there. It's a big house. They may have come in the back door and I didn't know. So she may have been able to do that. She also may have been able to bribe them. Later on, she bankrupted herself trying to support the French resistance, but at this point, she still had a great deal of cash. And nobody was more corrupt than the Vichy police. The Gestapo were totally in it for the cash. So it is possible she could have bribed her way out of that. Except there was other people in the basement of her house. Do we remember that nice little Belgian couple she brought down from Paris? Well, they weren't just Belgian. They were Jewish. And it didn't matter how charming she was or how rich she was. If Josephine Baker had been found aiding and abetting Jewish people at this point, she would have been arrested and she would have been sent to Germany if she wasn't executed immediately. Now, I want to make sure at this point you understand. Josephine Baker knew this was not a game. We're doing a lot of prisoner exchanges right now, recently with other countries. And we did that big exchange with Brittany Griner, right? For a guy who was out doing terrible things. And we even did prisoner exchanges during the war. That was actually pretty common, especially with spies. But Josephine Baker knew that that was not going to be an option for her. Even though she had dual citizenship, she was actually half American still. She was married to a Frenchman for part of this time, so she also had dual citizenship in France. But there was no way that Hitler could do that, could let her be part of a prisoner exchange. And she knew why. Because that would put a truth to the lie, what he had said about Jesse Owens. that would prove that she had worth, that would verify that she had value. And Hitler couldn't stand that. So he would execute her and he would make an example of Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker knew what the consequences were, and she did it anyway. I want to make sure that you know that she was very much aware of what was going on. So the Gestapo leave. Jack, who has been watching this from the river, thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on there, comes back in, and he goes, what happened? She tells him, and she's just like, we got to get out of here. Because the Gestapo commandant said he's keeping an eye on us, and he's watching, and they already know that we're working with the French resistance. So while they're making plans, they contact Palloy, and they're like, what should we do? Where should we go? Should we go to Britain? Because they could join Charles de Gaulle, who was fighting for the Free French in Britain. And Palloy's like, let me think about it for a little bit. He goes, but we're going to have to reach out to the British and see if they will support the French resistance, because what we need are weapons and radio sets to keep in contact with them. He goes, but we don't have anything to offer, so we're just going to have to go hat in hand and hope that they will accept, that we're not double agents, that we really want to fight for a free French. The very next day after the Gestapo came by, there's another knock on the door. It's very busy here. It's good she had 16 bedrooms. So this is someone no one expected. It is a 15-year-old boy, and he has this massive piece of luggage with him. So this is already suspicious, right? Because he looks like a refugee, and he could be stopped by the Vichy police or the Gestapo, just on the road. They could ask for his papers, and bad things would happen. Anyway, he insisted that he could only talk to Josephine Baker and that it was very important. Well, Lulu, her personal maid, was just like, nope, you're not getting to see Lady Josephine. That's just not going to happen. But this kid just wouldn't leave. He's just like, please, I have to. It's of the utmost importance, but I can only talk to her. So finally, Lulu lets him in. Josephine meets him. And he says, in here, in this massive piece of luggage, I have top secret Nazi information. I know that you hate Hitler. I know that you want to help us fight the Nazis. Please get this information to Britain. You're the only one I can trust. So Josephine listens to this, and she talks to Jack, and they're just like, this is probably a Gestapo ploy, right? They're going to try to trick them to show that they're willing to work with the resistance. So they actually send this kid packing. They're like, nope, we can't help you. We don't even want to know what's in that suitcase. But after the kid leaves, they start thinking again, and they're like, if the Gestapo was going to do this, we probably wouldn't do it the very next day after they, just did this hard target search. We're still putting furniture back together. And they're probably thinking they wouldn't send a 15-year-old boy to do it. It's just crazy enough that it's probably true. So they go this wild goose chase. It's a fascinating story in the book. They track this kid down again. They crack open that piece of luggage. And inside are 40 thick file folders of things labeled top secret Nazi information. Now, it's all in code, but Jack Apte is a super spy. Remember James Bond, he is a cipher expert, which means he can code and decode messages. And he decodes all this information. And what does he find? That is about the Luftwaffe. And it has vital information about airfields and airplanes and weapons. Oh my. So from having nothing to offer the British, suddenly they have intel gold. This is vital information that can truly help Britain in very practical ways. If nothing else, they could bomb the airfields by the Royal Air Force, and that way they could have, postponed the Blitzkrieg. So Jack and Josephine, have this information, but somehow they have to get it to Britain. Because remember, they're in Vichy, they can't just cross back through France, and they certainly cannot get passports and visas to go to Britain. So they call Palloy again and they go, hey, we got all this great information now. Where should we go? And he says, Portugal. Not what they were expecting. And they're like, Portugal? And he goes, yeah. I want you to go to Portugal and I want you to contact the British embassy there. So they make this plan. Once again, Josephine Baker doesn't go undercover. She goes as Josephine Baker. And she's going to perform in Portugal, which is neutral. So she can do that. So she's getting out of the war zone. But to do that, if you notice up on that far corner, that little green spot, that's France. So they have to cross all the way through Spain, which is Nazi-leaning, Nazi-sympathizing. And they're going to be, customs is going to be checking their luggage. And they're going to be looking at their visas and their passports. And now they've got all this information, right? The secret intel. Well, what they did was they put this information in invisible ink on Josephine Baker's sheet music. She had to perform anyway. So that's what they did. They had all the sheet music there, so they had a good reason to have it with them. He, once again, Jack was going undercover as her tour manager. So they had to get all through Spain and also through Portugal. Portugal was neutral, but they were going to be checking visas and they were going to go through their luggage as well. So this is really worrisome. Once again, they were taking their lives in their hands. Having top secret Nazi information? No, it's very dangerous. So they were very worried. But as it turned out, they had nothing to worry about because, first of all, Josephine Baker was Josephine Baker. She had her own passport. And also, they didn't want to check her luggage that closely because she had a lot of it. She was performing, and this is the sort of thing she would perform it. It doesn't fold up well, okay? I don't know what kind of garment bag you put that in. Maybe they used a big steamer trunk. They probably used several big steamer trunks because, she was also wearing stuff like this. I don't know what kind of hat box you put that headdress in, but she had a lot of luggage. And so they were very worried that they might find the sheet music, they might figure that something might be on there, but they had absolutely no trouble getting through Spain or through Portugal. And Josephine Baker had, he'd set up all these shows for her, and they were all sold out. So she was out performing at night. And what he said was, she's gonna tour South America after this. She had toured South America before, once again, very successfully. They weren't involved in the war, so she was just getting out of the war zone. So that gave Jack an excuse to go to Embassy Row. And he was trying to get in touch with this man, Dunderdale, Biffy Dunderdale. Now, you may not believe this, but a lot of you probably know that Ian Fleming, who came up with James Bond after the war, he based James Bond on this man named Biffy Dunderdale, who was also a seasoned spy. He was very much like Jack Apte, right? He knew about ciphers. He had gone through several daredevil missions. He was most definitely a 00. He had done plenty of assassins. So the other great thing about this was that Biffy knew Jack Apte. They had worked on missions before. They were friends, and they trusted each other. So Jack Apte goes to Embassy Row. He gives some of the sheet music and lets them know how to expose the invisible ink. And it goes to Biffy Dunderdale. And the reply back was, and I'll quote, "Jack and Josephine are much loved by Britain." He gave them this information, all this intel on the airfields and the airplanes and the weapons that they were going to use. So that was fabulous. And he set up a handler, a mysterious man named Mr. Bacon. And he says, so whenever you get information, intel, that you can send me, go through Bacon, and he'll go ahead and get me this information. So that was great. Another terrific, successful mission. And so, once again, Jack and Josephine thought that they were going to be sent to Britain following that, right, to work under Charles de Gaulle. But no. They contact Palais, and he goes, I need Josephine and Jack to go back to France. And the reason was because they didn't have any money. Remember, the Dizzy-M Bureau had been dissolved, so they didn't have any way to pay their spies. So they were actually using Josephine Baker's performance payments to actually fund the spies and fund the French resistance. This was her doing the Lindy. She's probably performing in Marseille. She set up a whole bunch of shows. Everybody loved Josephine Baker. Once again, remember, she was a superstar. She had no problem setting up shows. However, Jack, who was supposed to be her tour manager, couldn't get out of Portugal. They denied his visas. It was probably, we're not sure why, but it was probably because his cover was blown while he was in Portugal. Portugal at this point was a hive of spies. You could not spit in the face of someone without your spittle landing on the face of a covert agent. That's from all the countries, even the ones who were neutral. Somebody probably recognized Jack because he'd been in the spy game for quite some time. So he couldn't get out of Portugal to join Josephine like he was told to. So he had to do it illegally. So using his super spy skills, he gets out of Portugal. He has to cross all of Spain to finally get to France to get to Josephine. And they thought that, that was going to be a good thing. Josephine Baker is performing all these shows. However, Palais gets a hold of them, and he says, you have to get out of France now, because we have found out that Josephine is on the blacklist for the Abwehr. Now, the Abwehr was a secret police organization, worked very dedicatedly for the Nazis. It had nothing to do with justice. Don't be fooled by the name police. It all had to do with control, and they were brutal. And if Josephine Baker was on their list and was arrested, she would have probably been sent to a concentration camp. in Germany or executed immediately. So they had to leave. Once again, they thought they were going to Britain, but no, they were going to North Africa. So we're going to do a slight geography lesson here for those of you who, like me, may have had some problems with that in school. So if you'll notice that lower part, right along the top, the southern part of Europe, most of that is under Nazi control by this time. You got Spain in there, they're neutral, but like I said, Nazi sympathizing. You've got France that is now completely under German control. You have the Slavic countries, over farther. You've got Italy that's already part of the Axis. So most of southern Europe is already in Nazi control, and that also means they have a huge part of the Mediterranean. Almost all military historians agree that the Allies, or Britain at this time, because at this point they were the only dog in the fight, needed to have North Africa as a staging area if they were going to invade southern Europe and take it back from the Nazis. It is pretty much believed that if we hadn't had some control of North Africa, that we would all be speaking German right now. We probably would have lost the war. So this is a vital piece of land, because also if they had North Africa, the Nazis would have had complete control of the Mediterranean Sea. So they already had a whole bunch of U-boats there and battleships that was all hanging around the Italian peninsula. But if you'll notice up there at the tip of Morocco, that's the Straits of Gibraltar. And that controls who goes in and who goes out. If the U-boats were there, if the Nazis controlled all of the Mediterranean Sea, they could just let the U-boats go out, sink the convoys that had troops and supplies from Britain and the United States later on, and they could just go back and, after they sank the convoys, they could go back to the safety of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's probably why they would have won the war. So here we go. We go to North Africa, and what they need to do is convince this man, El Ghlawi, who was a pasha, like a governor in Morocco, that he can trust them. Now, keep in mind, the Germans also knew the importance of North Africa and getting complete control of the Mediterranean Sea. So they already had Rommel there, one of the great generals. He was down there, he was called the Desert Fox. And initially he tried diplomacy. He's like, you know what, you should throw in with us. Don't go with Europe. The Belgians, the French, the British, they subjugated you. They colonized you after you had had autonomy for centuries. Don't go fighting for them. They're not worth it. You should throw in with us. Hitler's going to take care of you. He's a great guy. Well, let me tell you something. El Ghlawi and his fellow caliphs and sultans were not stupid, right? Because they also had watched, they'd seen the newsreels of the 1936 Olympics, and they also heard what Hitler had said about Jesse Owens. So they're not going to be throwing in with Hitler. They know what he's like. So then Jack Apte goes, on behalf of the British. This shows how big Jack Apte was, how much Biffy Dunderdale and the people in Britain trusted him. He was supposed to go and negotiate to see if El Ghlawi and the other people who were in charge of North Africa would throw in with the British. But keep in mind, Jack Apte is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and he speaks Arabic because he's multilingual, but he speaks it with a French accent. So once again, he was just like the people who had subjugated him. And El Ghlawi is just like, you know what? I don't want to deal with you either. He was not very hip to the whole thing about joining the British, because, as I said, many of the African countries had been colonized by Britain and were not treated very well. So the North Africans had a third option, right? As opposed to joining with either side, they could have just remained neutral. They could have let the two sides fight it out amongst themselves, right? Germany and Britain, they could go ahead and beat each other up. Whoever the victor was, depleted after fighting the other side, then the North Africans could go ahead and jump in, and maybe they could fight off whoever the winner was. Because at this point, El Ghlawi and many of the other leaders of North Africa already had underground networks. They were already working on overthrow because they didn't like being subjugated. So they had people in the civil service that were keeping track of the troop movements that the Germans were making. Because once diplomacy didn't work for the Desert Fox, trust me, Rommel was willing to take Northern Africa by force. So they also had all these people who were watching what was going on in the Mediterranean Sea. So they had information about U-boats and battleships and, like I said, German troop movements within North Africa. They had all this special intel. but they wouldn't give it to Jack. But they didn't know about the secret weapon that the British had at this point. And her name was Josephine Baker. So Josephine Baker goes to talk to El Glaoui, and he agrees with Kemi, who introduced me, that she was a very beautiful woman. She was incredibly charming and very smart. And also, he was a big fan, as many North Africans were, of Princess Tam Tam. What a great movie! I saw that 5 times. You know, he really enjoys Josephine Baker. She is, like I said, she's charming, she's wonderful, she's multilingual. They have long conversations, and she tells him, you have to trust me. Hitler is going to double-cross you. Hitler's all about subjugating everyone. So he's not going to set you free after the war is over. You should throw in with the British. They are your best chance. I trust them. You should trust them. So it is because of Josephine Baker that El Glaoui and many of the North African leaders put the secret intel they had from their underground networks at the disposal of the British because of Josephine. A lot of people don't know that. This was relatively new information to anybody outside of France. So El Glaoui threw in with them, which was great, and he actually gave Jack and Josephine one of his palaces here in Marrakesh, known as the Paris of the Sahara. So they were set up pretty nicely. But then tragedy strikes again. The mysterious Mr. Bacon, they reach out to him. They're like, hey, we've got all this intel gold again. We've got all this information about German troop movements and, how many U-boats they have. And the mysterious Mr. Bacon tells them to stand down. Now, we don't know. It is lost to history. First of all, we don't even know who Mr. Bacon was. Obviously, it's a cover name. But we don't know why he told them to stand down. So now Jack and Josephine are frustrated because they have all this information. It is time sensitive. It is vital for the British to know, but they don't have a way to get it to them. And along come the 12 apostles. Now, they're not probably the 12 apostles you're thinking. They are Murphy's 12 apostles. These were undercover spies for the Office of Strategic Services. That's the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The United States was very, very slow getting in the spy game. We didn't have a lot of spy knowledge. Actually, Wild Bill Donovan, that ran the OSS, went to Britain to get training on what to show his spies. But Wild Bill Donovan and Franklin Roosevelt knew how important, once again, North Africa was. They weren't even in the war yet, but they wanted their spies to do reconnaissance to find out, who was pro-Hitler, who was anti-Hitler, like what, kind of get a temperature of what was going on there. But the problem with, first of all, sending 12 men into an enormous piece of territory, they weren't going to find out much information. But they couldn't find out any information. Why? Because just like Jack Apte, they were mostly blonde hair and blue-eyed, and they spoke their Arabic with a strange accent. They weren't trusted. So the 12 apostles couldn't get any information to send back to FDR. Jack and Josephine had information, but they didn't have any way to get it to the British. So Jack and Josephine met a couple of the 12 apostles, most namely Paul Canfield. And they kind of were circling each other because they all thought they were covert operatives, but they weren't sure. You could never be so sure then. But they invited him over to the big, palace in Marrakesh. And finally, Jack Apte thought, this information is too vital, so I got to tell him. So he said to Paul Canfield, I'm wondering if you could go to the American embassy and send some information to the British for me. And Paul Canfield goes, who do you want to talk to? And Jack Apte says, Dunderdale, Biffy Dunderdale. And Paul goes, I know Biffy, because it turns out all these spies actually knew each other, because most of them worked in the upper echelons. They had gone to all these fancy colleges. And so he immediately gets this information. They trust each other now, especially since he knows Biffy Dunderdale. And all this information is transmitted. They had a special transmitter, the 12 apostles did, all to Biffy Dunderdale. He gets all this information about U-boats and German troop movements. And once again, Jack and Josephine are much loved by Britain. So they get this information, and that pipeline of information is reopened. When Biffy finds out that the mysterious Mr. Bacon had told them to stand down, he is furious. Nobody told him what happened. He was afraid that Jack and Josephine were in the clutches of the Nazis, because he knew also that the Abwehr was after Josephine. So that was horrific. But now, the lines of communication are open. That's all good. So at this point, like I said, Jack is kind of compromised because they're afraid that maybe his cover's been blown. But Josephine, she may be being looked for by the Abwehr, but she just can't go into Nazi territory. However, Biffy Dunderdale and El Glaue work together so that Josephine can go into Spain. She is given a transit visa by El Glaue, which you might know about transit visas if you're a fan of Casablanca, and if you aren't, you really should go watch it. You can get it from the library. We got plenty of copies. So she's given a transit visa, which basically means as long as it's signed by an authority figure, it's not supposed to be questioned. She can't go into German territory, but she can go into Spain, which is supposed to be a neutral country. And her mission there is to go find out who is pro-Nazi and who is anti-Nazi. And if they're anti-Nazi, she is supposed to create spy cells in Spain to set up along the border with Italy so that they can reach out to the partisans that are fighting the Nazis there and that they can find out, once again, the troop movements so that the RAF know who to bomb in Italy. So this is, once again, vital information. This isn't chump change. This isn't a game. Josephine Baker is doing substantial spy work. She can't go with Jack. She has to go alone, and she does. And once again, extremely successful. This is major news. The British are really grateful, and we make some progress. The British make some progress in Italy because of that. Unfortunately, after that mission, and like I said, she did a lot of work while she was over in Spain. Tragedy strikes again. Unfortunately, Josephine Baker becomes extremely ill. She ends up with peritonitis, which in the late 1930s, early 40s, which is the time period, often was fatal. It's also an excruciatingly painful disease. It has to do with the inflammation of the material around your major organs, your stomach, your heart, your lungs. So she was in excruciating pain at this time. Jack Apte and Paul Canfield ran her to a hospital, and the first hospital they took her to, they were like, this is too big for us. And they sent them into Casablanca to this place called the Comte Clinic, where there was a surgeon who could handle that sort of thing. Excuse me. Josephine Baker, like I said, was very ill. She was in a lot of pain. Sometimes she was delirious with fever. Jack Apte never left her side except for when he had to go on spy missions in North Africa. Now, at this time also, Josephine Baker had a miscarriage. And I don't say that to be exploitative. I say that to show what fortitude this woman had. She was already in excruciating physical pain with a disease that could very well be fatal. But now she lost a baby, and that is what she wanted more than anything in the world, more than all that money and all that fame. So she had all this emotional pain. It was probably Jack Apte's child. It may have been El Glaue's. And she had all this physical pain. But she kept fighting. She kept her spirits up. One of the things that she told her surgeon was, because she had to have 5 surgeries for this disease she had, she says, you might as well just go ahead and sew a zipper into my abdomen because it'll make it easier access next time you have to go in there. She really kept her spirits up. The other thing is she didn't stop with the spy business because they used her hospital room. She was there for 2 years. This is how sick she was. 2 years during the latter part of the war. They use it as a dead drop. So we're going to work on more of your spy skills here, okay? So for those of you who don't know, what a dead drop is you've got Spy A over here. And he's got something like maps or names of double agents, and he takes it to a designated spot, in this case, Josephine Baker's hospital room. And then he leaves. And then you got Spy B over here. And she might have some information. She might have some maps or some forged documents. So she goes to the same dead drop, right, Josephine Baker's hospital room. She picks up what Spy A left, and she drops off something else, and then she leaves. At no time are the 2 spies in the same place at the same time. Now, unbeknownst to most of us, this turned out to be brilliant that they used Josephine Baker's hospital room. Why? If it was just some crazy librarian with red hair, nobody would be going visiting. It would be highly suspicious. But it didn't matter that the Gestapo may have been watching her hospital room because Josephine Baker was a global superstar. Everybody loved her, right? She had dual citizenship with America and France, so all of those people could go visit. Not suspicious, just checking out how she was. She had performed throughout the world. She had performed in North Africa, so El Glaue and all of his friends stopping by, not a problem. The British stopping by, she used to perform there a lot, not a problem. So even while she was very ill, sometimes, like I said, delirious with fever, and sometimes suffering, a lot of people would have just said, you know what, I did my part. I've done all these great missions for you guys, got all this great intel. I'm done now. But Josephine didn't. She stuck with it. She stuck with it through the 2 years that she was in that hospital. Towards the end of her stay there, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in the United States finally got involved in World War II. That is really when Josephine Baker's spy business stopped. But she didn't give up the fight. She joined the USO when she was well enough to perform. She performed throughout North Africa during most of the rest of the war. And she didn't stop fighting for equality either, because it was the Army's policy to separate the black troops from the white troops, so that just the normal non-commissioned GIs could be up front next to the stage to see the gorgeous and talented Miss Baker. But the black troops, even the officers, were supposed to stand to the back of the theater or the venue. But Josephine Baker goes, oh no, not on my watch. You either integrate the crowds or I don't perform. And because Josephine Baker was Josephine Baker, the armed forces listened. And every performance she did, they integrated the crowds. And that is a great thing. After the war, Josephine Baker was awarded I have to cheat here a little. She was awarded the Distinction of the Resistance Française, the Croix de Guerre, and the Légion d'Honneur for all of the things that she did and the sacrifices that she made and the intelligence she gathered. So I hope that this has given you a good idea of all the fabulous things that Josephine Baker did that she was not famous for. She was famous for her singing and her dancing and her performing, but she really went and showed great fortitude, and she made many sacrifices for freedom and democracy. Thank you.